Hey guys, I'm coming back with some more watercolor wash homemade paints. A little bit of work with that, and I just wanted to follow up. Since the last video, I did discover that I had some turmeric in my house, so I did go ahead and use that color, which turned out quite nice. It's a really rich color. I also grabbed some red onion skins and simmered those a little bit with a little bit of water and got a nice interesting red color that kind of comes across as gray as well as red. So that was kind of cool. I tried carrots and yellow onion skins, and those created a nice orange yellow color. Um, and then I don't know if I had tea in the mix when I made the last video, but I found that tea, I did talk about tea, but when I worked with it, it made a really intense reddish brown, which was different than the coffee. So I've used that since then too. I just want to give you some tips for working with watercolor or watery homemade paints. Um, First of all, I want to encourage you to use a palette. A palette is a place for you to test out your paint, move it around, check the intensity before you apply it to your paper. Um, the paper in your sketchbooks is definitely not made for paint. So we have to be especially careful with that paper. And I know that the way it behaves with paint is going to be way different than if we were using the appropriate material. So if you have heavier paper at home, like Bristol or watercolor paper or mixed media paper, go ahead and use those because they're going to hold up to the water a little bit better. But if not, just be especially careful with the surface as you work with it because you can get away with it, but it's got to be not a lot of friction, less moving around, a lot of liquid. Just kind of be aware of that, and also letting things dry. So before you start to apply anything to your paper, take a white plate and just put some of that color on there and push it around with some water and see how much pigment you have there before you pick it up and take it over to your paper. And I'll show you how I do that. Paper can only hold so much water, even stuff that's made for this. So you might have to apply a wash, let it dry, come back, do it again in order to build up the layers of intensity. So in some of the paintings that I'm going to show you, it took time to get to that place. So you might do a wash, get it somewhere, and then be patient. Go away, come back, and then add some more after it's dry. And then the other thing is with watercolor, you have to work light to dark, but that means that the lightest things that you want on your paper, you have to decide ahead of time. Like, okay, where are the brightest whites in this scene? So for a portrait, if you look at the video of me right now, look for the lightest parts that you see in my face. And so we're looking for a couple things like the forehead has a pretty light area there, the tip of the nose, the cheekbones, sometimes the chin right here. So those are some of the areas where you might have some bright areas. And you'll notice that the whites of my eyes are not really that bright. They're actually kind of shaded. So just kind of keep that in mind. So when I started to do some shading of portraits, I did choose a couple areas, like on the self-portrait, I chose the forehead and the nose as places where I would leave a pure white and work around that. So you'll see that as you look at these two pieces that I worked on. So those are my main tips for watercolor. Leave whites unpainted, and then you can move in on those and carve them down a little bit later if you need to. Build up your values over time, let it dry, and add more. And you can even add new colors on top. So if you want to create some interesting shading, sometimes adding a blue color into those areas where you had a warm color. That warm color with blue will kind of create a shadow. So just kind of keep that in mind, that you can use multiple colors in different areas at different times. So I'll just talk a little bit about the two portraits that I did. In the self-portrait, I took a photo, and what I did was I did a contour, a continuous contour. That's what we've done in class, where you have not picked your pencil up. And when you do that, a lot of times there's going to be some distortion, because like when I drew this drawing, what I did on one side didn't match up on the other side. So then I had to figure out how to make those two close and come together. And there's some distortion there. I'm okay with that. It's my portrait. So if it looks distorted, no big deal, right? So I think it gives a character. So I went ahead and left it that way. I didn't try to fix it. And I know that the tendency for some students is to try to make things look perfect. So for me, it was okay. For you, it might be harder to do that. But if you realize that it gives a lot of character when you leave things a little bit looser. So be okay with that. Maybe embrace it. The second portrait that I did was one that my daughter was kind enough to draw in her style. And I thought that I would do something that was different than the distorted contour line portrait, and work with something that's a little bit more kind of idealized. It kind of, to me, has a little bit of a cartoon character kind of. It's a character. So I went ahead and worked with that one as well. And I'll just say a couple words about the colors. In mine, I started with coffee as the main shading for the skin, as well as like the glasses and the hair. And then eventually I started to use the tea a little bit for areas like I tried the eyebrows with tea. It was like a reddish brown. And then as I worked, I used turmeric for the background, that golden color. And then I used, the shirt I was actually wearing was really navy blue with polka dots, and I couldn't really do that in a watercolor style. So I went ahead and tried to use the blueberry juice. It really wasn't that dark. And then I added more on top with the red onion color, and that added a little bit more magenta to it, which was fine. But I didn't try to make it look realistic necessarily, but I was looking at a photo to help me with shading and things like that. I use photo references for most of the work that I do. So when I started looking, I started to see like that there were shadows under the glasses, or I saw that there were, my eyelids were darker in the middle and on the outside, but in the center of the eyelid, it was lighter. So you can see shading from the outside inward. And some of those things like that, you wouldn't really know unless you saw a photo or saw a reference. So just kind of keep that in mind. Looking at something, even if it's not the thing, gives you a feel for how you can approach something else. So I did that. And then when I wanted to go really dark in the areas of the hair, I started to use the pigment was starting to dry out. The instant coffee was starting to dry out. So I started to pick up some of that intense coffee, and it was almost like a paste. So I started to apply that quite thick, and it was going on in a sticky, thick way. And when it dried, it was almost glossy to the reflective. And that's because the coffee, when it evaporated, it became really intense. And then I'm trying to think if there's any other colors I used in there. I started to use a little bit of that red in the skin in a few places as well, either the blueberry or the red onion. And I didn't really use the other colors that I mixed up. I had a pretty big palette, but I have ones that I particularly wanted to use. And then as I did the portrait that my daughter drew, I started with turmeric in the background. It was a nice yellow wash. And then I went ahead and did coffee for the skin, just in the areas where I knew that there would be some shading, knowing that I would be building it up more later. And I did leave some areas white so that I would have some contrast. You'll see like down the middle of the neck, and then in the nose, I think in the chin. So, and so then as I kind of built up, I used the tea color, which was quite red, kind of a coppery color in the hair. And then I went ahead and I did the blueberry and the red onion in the shirt, and just started to build up the coffee for different layers inside the face. And so I used the red onion in the lips, And some of the shading that I did, there were some things that I kind of thought about and thought, I know that under the nose there's going to be shadows. I also know that there's that separator between the two lips where there's going to be shadows. The lip is angled outward, so you often will get a little lighter on the lips. And then on top of the lip, there's a shine usually. So I was thinking about that as I shaded, trying to leave room for those things. And then the eye socket is a darker area. Sometimes the brow is more lit. But see, since the hair came down to that level, there wasn't enough room there for there to be a lot of light on the brow. So I just kind of had to work through some of those, and to me it's unfinished at this point, but I still think that we're able to get to a place where a lot of color has been added, and you can kind of see how I was using universal light logic, which is like the idea of where does light usually come from? Usually comes from above or to one side. So then what happens to the face when that light is playing off of it? So then you're looking at all the different surfaces and where they angle, so you can figure out where the light would be and where the shadow would be. And so you're kind of applying that without really seeing it. And so that's okay. That's what we're doing. So I just wanted to talk about that, show you those, and I want you to give it a try. You can draw any type of portrait that you want. It can be very basic, but then I want you to start thinking about light logic. Where does light come from? What surfaces bounce light? How they receive the light, either by getting a highlight or by creating shadows. So we've talked about this in class with portraiture, and I think now we're just applying it in a new way. Instead of with graphite, now we're using watercolor washes, which actually is a little bit easier to smooth and blend. So hopefully you'll feel comfortable with the way that we're doing this. All right, have fun with that, and I can't wait to see what you guys do.